This is the Trickstuff Maxima, a German hyperbrake that is infamous for being the most expensive and most powerful option on the market today, and it truly has the performance to back up these claims. And this is the Lewis LHP-U4, a premium Chinese brake that has been openly derived from the Trickstuff Maxima, and it claims to have the same excellent performance with additional creature comforts, all at a price point that competes in an entirely different category. I've spent a lot of time riding with these two brake sets over the past couple of months, and today I'm going to compare them in great detail, outline the pros and cons of each, and give you my final recommendation as to which brake is right for you. It's a battle of communism versus capitalism, so let's get into it. I've uploaded dedicated review videos for both the Maximas and LHPs within the last month, which cover everything you'd possibly want to know about either brake. So today we're going to focus on comparing these brakes instead. I encourage you to watch these videos afterwards if you'd like to learn more about either option though. Thanks again to Eric from Unamoto for allowing me to borrow his Maximas, which will be for sale before New Year's, and to Lewis for sending me their LHP brakes with no expectations or deliverables in return. They are not and have never been a sponsor of this channel. Now both of these brakes are 4-piston hydraulic disc brakes. Both are rated for downhill and enduro intended uses, both utilize the Hope V4 brake pad standard, both use mineral oil, both have a hole through their master cylinder, both have a 2-piece bolted caliper, and both feature a CNC design with an uncannily similar visual appearance. On paper and in your hands, these appear to be very similar brakes for good reason. Let's jump straight into what everyone wants to hear and compare their on-trail performance first. When both brakes have been recently serviced, set up to your liking, and are operating at their best, they offer very similar on-trail performance. To ensure as fair a test as possible, I also use the exact same brake pads and rotors while testing each brake. The Maximas are one of my favorite brakes that I've ever tested, providing an abundance of intuitive power with a lighter than average lever feel, helping to reduce rider fatigue as much as possible. They're able to easily stop even the heaviest of riders on the steepest of trails without any hesitation, and likely also with minimal to no fading or overheating. It's hard to describe how powerful their input force to output force curve feels if you've never tried a set in the parking lot before. The LHPs offered a very similar level of performance, although they aren't quite as brutal as the Maximas are. With the leverage ratio adjustment dialed into their most aggressive position, which I define as having the sharpest bite point and steepest ramp up in power, I found that the LHPs had somewhere around 5 to 10% less power at the caliper than the Maximas did with a comparable force input at the lever, measured qualitatively through repeated laps on the same test loop on both brakes. This contributed to slightly more rider fatigue with the LHPs, although still an excellent performance overall that is better than most of the brakes on the market today. The LHPs also have a slightly softer feeling bite point than the Maximas, even in their most aggressive leverage ratio setting. Beginner to intermediate riders may appreciate the softer bite point given the immense power available after the dead stroke, but the Maximas have a more premium feeling crispness that intermediate to advanced riders will definitely appreciate. Both brakes feature a progressive ramp up in power initially that provides great low force modulation, so I didn't find that a softer bite point provided any functional advantage, and I definitely preferred the sharpness of the Maxima in this regard. Neither bite point wandered throughout my testing, and both brakes had a very similar feel between front and rear, which would suggest that the performance differences noted here are a result of design decisions rather than the quality of their bleeds. With so many variables at play, it's hard to identify a specific reason behind these differences in performance, given the overall similarity in design, but Lewis claims that this softer bite point is a result of their new dual diameter master cylinder piston, which has been designed to improve reliability and reduce the potential for leaking. But I would guess that part of this difference also comes down to Lewis's implementation of their leverage ratio adjustment feature. The leverage ratio adjustment feature on the LHP is a very unique and innovative option, but it could result in the LHP being unable to reach the same aggressive feeling kinematic position that makes the Maximas so special. Throughout my ride testing, I experimented with the leverage ratio adjustment in the 4 90-degree positions that were easiest to explain with an external reference position, along with one 45-degree position between my two favorite 90-degree positions. Despite this infinite adjustability, I found myself still preferring the Maxima's performance characteristics. The LHPs definitely came impressively close to matching their performance in my preferred lever blade far leverage ratio position, but it felt like any deviation from that preferred position resulted in degraded overall performance by providing a slower ramp up in power or an even softer bite point. Other riders may disagree with my opinion here, and that's okay because personal preference is definitely a thing, but just because an adjustment is offered, that doesn't mean that it improves the peak performance of the product, and it is often a way for end users to just make it worse. Flip chips on full suspension frames are often a great example of this, where a bike will be clearly designed with a specific configuration in mind for ideal performance, and secondary configurations are more of a marketing device that have significant compromises in either kinematics or geometry. A range of adjustment is most useful when the majority of customers fall within that range offered, rather than desiring something that is slightly outside of the design spec. Speaking of which, the reach adjustment dials on both brakes offer an industry-leading range of adjustment where almost every rider will be able to find their ideal lever blade position. Lewis claims that they have implemented 2 additional improvements over the Maxima's design with this LHP model, the first of which are the independent cooling fins. These cooling fins are held captive in the caliper, and Lewis claims that they are there to improve heat dissipation performance, although I do question the real-world thermal benefits of such a claim without the quantitative data to back it up. These fins did not rattle or distract from riding at all, due largely in part to Lewis choosing the beefiest brake pad spring that I have ever seen. It is unclear if these cooling fins are removable, as that would require a complete rebleed of the brake, as you would have to separate the 2 halves of the caliper in order to remove these fins. These cooling fins sit in line between the pistons and brake pads too, and removing them may cause the pistons to extend too far out of the caliper by the thickness of the backplate of the fins, which could present as a piston leaking issue, or they may fall out entirely with thinner rotors. I would therefore assume that they are not to be removed without Lewis explicitly mentioning so as an option on their website. As someone who weighs around 62 kilograms, I did not observe a functional benefit to these cooling fins on the trail, and I had no issues with the Maxima's overheating during steep sustained laps dropping over 600 meters of elevation in a single go. I've also never read about any heavier riders online overheating the Maxima brakes either. To me, the LHP's cooling fins appear to be primarily a marketing move, look fast, go fast, and although they surely provide a small tangible benefit, I would prefer the option to purchase these brakes without them. That would make the LHPs lighter, cheaper to manufacture, and a simpler design that has less potential to become annoying over time. The other claimed improvement is Lewis's bite point adjustment. From a ride performance viewpoint, I see no reason why anyone would choose to run these brakes with anything other than the bite point adjustment wound all the way in order to minimize the dead stroke lever travel distance as much as possible. But when looking at it from a bleeding perspective, this bite point adjustment is actually a pretty handy feature, so let's talk about that. The most common complaint about the Trickstuff Maxima online is that they can be a bit finicky and trickier than average to bleed. When Nimby installed these Trickstuff Maximas onto my bike, we followed Trickstuff's excellent online bleeding documentation to the letter, and it produced excellent, consistent, and long-lasting results on the very first attempt. Now, yes, the process is slightly more involved than the lazy Shimano lever cup bleed that many are used to, but if you use their proprietary Bionol fluid and follow every step with care, including the critical step where the lever is rotated 90 degrees relative to the handlebar, I don't see an obvious reason as to where this bleeding procedure would produce inconsistent results. A quick Google will also show you that Lewis has experienced very similar bleeding complaints online, although it appears to be at a higher per capita frequency, at least on the English half of the internet. Curiously, Lewis does not appear to include the 90-degree lever rotation step on the handlebar that Trickstuff has deemed to be important. Although I did not have to bleed my LHP brakes, as the factory bleed was sufficient, I've watched all of Lewis's bleeding tutorials and previously bled a set of their LH4 brakes when I reviewed those. I believe that there is little difference in the complexity of bleeding these 2 brakes, and I believe there is some nuance behind why Trickstuff owners will complain less about this process on average. Trickstuff is selling their brakes to very affluent customers, who I believe to be more likely to have an experienced, qualified bike shop service their brakes for them. The average shop mechanic is very likely to be more skilled at bleeding brakes than the average consumer is, and this should produce better results on average. Trickstuff also explicitly mentions that you should only use new Bionol fluid when servicing their brakes, and although I wish they were more open to different grades or brands of mineral oil, this restriction is an easy way for them to control a very large variable in the servicing process, and thus produce more consistent results. I believe that Lewis customers are likely more careful with their money on average, and are therefore more likely to service their own brakes, rather than bringing them to a shop as their cost of living increases. Combine this with Lewis not specifying a specific type of mineral oil in any of their documentation, and you have a recipe for a higher proportion of subpar bleeds with the exact same bleeding complexity. This is where I believe the bite point adjustment comes in handy. The way I view this feature is as a bad bleed compensator. The range of adjustment with this set screw is quite dramatic on the trail, and winding it in after bleeding the brakes with it wound all the way out provides an excellent way for riders to correct a non-ideal bleed, and reduce the dead stroke lever travel distance to a reasonable amount. The 2mm hex head is as convenient as it needs to be, as this is not something that you will likely be tinkering with out on the trail, and provides a set and forget it style compensation during the initial setup process. This bite point adjustment is the one feature that the LHPs have that I wish the Maximas also had, as it would be nice to have an even shorter dead stroke than what they have designed it to have. I believe that the Maximas take the win for ride performance, although both brakes are great options in the grand scheme of things. Next, let's talk about one of the most common misconceptions about these brakes, and that would be their build quality. I physically brought these brakes to probably 10 different people, and nobody could identify a single manufacturing related quality difference between the two. Both brakes are works of art, and as long as all of the screws were tight on the LHP's levers, which we'll discuss in a minute, there was no perceptible difference between how solid their assembly or lever actuation felt. These are both very well made brakes with no nicks, scratches, or imperfections to speak of, which would make sense given that they utilize the exact same manufacturing process. Of course, not all CNCs are made equal, but there is absolutely no way to tell which brake was manufactured in Germany and which brake was manufactured in China, without referring to the anodized branding throughout the product. Automatically assuming that the Chinese product is cheaply manufactured without first-hand experience with both brands is xenophobic, regardless of whether or not you agree with Lewis's business practices. Manufacturing is manufacturing, and both brands have done an excellent job in this regard, and I have no reason to doubt that they are able to hit similar tolerances in production. I understand that there could also be a selection bias at play here as well, in the sense that Lewis could have sent me a particularly clean LHP model for testing, but I've seen production Lewis brakes in the field a handful of times, and they appear to have the exact same build quality as this one. CNCs tend to produce very repeatable results as long as the tool is sharp, so I would not expect wild variations in fit and finish between serial numbers of either brake. That doesn't mean there aren't differences between these two brakes, however, and in order to understand them, we are going to have to look at the business strategy and market positioning of both brands. Trickstuff has undeniably positioned themselves as one of the most premium brake manufacturers in the industry. They've amassed glowing performance reviews over the years, and they have an almost cult-like following online, and riders expect their brakes to be the best of the best by many different measures. To my knowledge, Trickstuff does not make a single bad brake, and you know you're getting a very high minimum level of quality when you buy into their lineup. As a side effect of this reputation, however, Trickstuff has been one of the most conservative brands in the industry when it comes to releasing new products or new features. Their Maxima is almost 6 years old, and their 𝙎𝙘𝙤𝙤𝙤𝙤 is nearly 9 years old. I believe that both were significantly ahead of their time when they were released, and they still hold up to the options available today. Both have seen running changes over the years, but nothing overly dramatic, as both brakes were already very refined at their initial release. There are no surprises, you know exactly what you are getting, and Trickstuff doesn't add any additional features that you don't strictly need for peak performance. Trickstuff is also targeting a very specific consumer with the brakes that they offer, and they have designed a brake that fits that consumer's requirements nearly perfectly. And nearly perfectly comes at a price. If you want the best, you'll have to pay for the best, especially given that it's manufactured and assembled in Europe. Lewis, on the other hand, has taken almost entirely the opposite approach to their strategic business decisions. Rather than spending precious time and energy meticulously ensuring each product is as good as it can be, Lewis has been iterating at speeds rarely seen in the bike industry, and they're already on their third generation of brakes in only 2 years of operation. Trickstuff currently has 4 different brake models for sale, Lewis has 8, and in significantly more colorways too. Lewis has certainly made the most of their agile size and vertical integration in these 2 years, and have benefited from one of the most successful marketing efforts that I've seen recently. I'm always a fan of fast innovation, but it also comes at a price, just not a monetary one. Lewis was very transparent, at least on Chinese social media, that the purpose of their first generation of brakes released within the domestic market was to fast-track their research and development efforts by getting as many on-trail hours as possible. Although they've not explicitly said that since, I believe that this mentality has been carried into Lewis's second and now third generation of brakes as well, and it is evident with my experiences with their LHPs. Although stellar performers for the most part, the LHPs certainly have a few quirks that can be best explained as a company that is rushing a bit too quickly to get new models out the door. My biggest concern was the leverage ratio adjustment feature. In my review, I outlined how the LHP system is not as convenient or repeatable to use as their previous LHT design, and both brakes have an interference problem that could limit the amount of braking power available, as the lever blade can bottom out on the reach adjustment dial before contacting the grip in certain settings. I'd estimate the likelihood of you landing on this position at random that could cause an interference to be around 10%, which, in my opinion, is 10% too many. The leverage ratio adjustment dial is also unfortunately not toolless, being locked into place by 2 tiny 1.5mm hex head set screws in an awkward to access location. During my testing, I had 2 of these screws come loose on one of my levers, and although I did not notice whether or not the leverage ratio adjustment system drifted over the course of the ride, partly due to it not having anodized markings, the lever blade developed a significant amount of play that was not indicative of the quality that Lewis wants you to associate with their products. If they had taken a bit more time internally in the design and testing phase, I believe it is less likely that these issues would have made it to production. To Lewis's credit though, they reached out to me on Instagram within 72 hours of my LHP review going live, and they outlined specifically how they are going to improve each of these issues that I mentioned. They're going to add more clearance so that the leverage ratio interference cannot occur, they're going to increase the size of the set screws to accommodate a 2mm hex head, and they're going to add a weak thread locker to them during assembly to keep them from rattling loose over time. I am impressed with this response, and I genuinely believe that Lewis is going to implement these as running changes in a timely fashion. I just wish it was done before the initial batch of customers received their brakes. Conducting any level of research research and development on production brakes is a risky strategy that you must accept as a Lewis customer. Lewis definitely makes some solid brakes, especially the aspects that have been openly reverse engineered, but some of their claimed upgrades appear to have been made in the name of marketing efficiency rather than engineering performance, and they aren't without their quirks either. I don't know if parts are interchangeable between these two brakes, and I have no intention of finding out as I do not own these Maximas. Another point worth mentioning is that neither Lewis or Trickstuff make any mention of a warranty on their websites. Lewis mentioned on their Bilibili account that they offer a lifetime warranty within China and a 1-year warranty for foreign countries. Trickstuff reviewers have noted in the past that Trickstuff offered a 2-year warranty on their brakes, although this is ultimately secondhand information and may be out of date. There are no dedicated warranty pages, and nothing is mentioned on the product pages either. Both brands need to do better here, and it is probably a legal requirement too. So where does this leave us? Well, price and controversy aside, I would rather own a pair of Maximas than LHPs, but I'd also rather own LHPs than anything SRAM or Shimano have to offer. The Maximas are an extremely refined product, one that is an accurate reflection of their luxury price tag, and they've chosen not to make their design any more complicated than it needs to be. They are consistently phenomenal performers and are definitely a buy it for life quality product. They also happen to cost 1,300 euros, which is approximately 1,400 bald eagles, or around 2,000 Canadian, meaning that Trickstuff is confidently targeting the top 1% customer who wants the absolute best performance regardless of the price. This is where Lewis comes in. Lewis has priced their LHPs at 439 Big Macs, which is approximately 615 Canadian or 416 euros. This means that the LHPs cost 31% of what the Maximas cost, or you could buy 3 sets of LHPs and still have money left over for a nice dinner. The Maximas surely don't have 3 times the performance, as diminishing returns is a thing, but as we've discussed, this cost comes at a cost. Lewis thrives in the morally grey zone. The recent 5-dev-inspired crank teaser makes that extremely clear, but I believe that they have not crossed any red lines legally and broken any actual laws. Lewis believes that their list of claimed improvements over the Maxima and 𝙎𝙘𝙤𝙤 models constitute a significant enough change for them to sell their LHP as a unique product. But Lewis simply wouldn't be where they are today without Trickstuff's original design, innovation, and decades of research and development, and Lewis would be the first one to admit that, as they have on Bilibili before. Reverse engineering is a very common practice among engineers all around the world. I've even done a handful myself. The difference here is that Asian companies often say the quiet part out loud, and Lewis's industrial design decisions are intentionally a bit more shameless than most. It's up to you to decide whether you are okay with these practices, and I encourage you to vote with your money. The good part about this is that I believe Lewis has positioned themselves to target a completely different demographic than Trickstuff, and I'd be surprised if they shared more than a rounding error of potential buyers, given the extreme discrepancy in their price point. I don't believe that either brand affects the sales of the other to any meaningful degree, and it all boils down to the age-old debate of engineering versus marketing, with some good old global dynamics thrown in for good measure. At the end of the day, my recommendation is that if you can afford the Maximas, then buy the Maximas. You will not be disappointed. Otherwise, ask your doctor if Lewis is right for you, and let me know in the comments below which brake you'd rather have, and which brake you want me to review next.